For the GMTK Game Jam 2025, we made a rhythm game about looping sounds. We came 34th in audio, and averaging our scores outside of narrative, we ended up with an equivalent overall rating of 4.07, which would have put us in 213th place in last year's rankings, just short of the top 200 out of 9,500 games. I wanted to do a post-mortem and talk about what went well and what didn't, so that I have something to look back on for next Game Jam and to try to improve. I'm going to start with a brief run-through of how we put everything together, then take a critical lens to the game as is, and discuss what improvements could have helped potentially crack the top 200. This year I worked with Gloom, our artist, and Pinkerella, an audio engineer / game designer, and I was in charge of coding, systems, and integration. We discussed a couple of looping beat ideas, which felt like a good lead as it would give our sound designer a bit more room to contribute audio on top of game design ideas. It reminded me of the GMTK 2020 Game Jam, back when the theme was out of control, and the first two games Mark showed off, Restless Wing Syndrome and Laserwave, both use similar features to have your abilities fire off on a timer. Laserwave specifically had your jump and shoot playing to the beat of a song. This felt like a great jumping off point, as it was a really interesting concept and very flowy, but I had a few issues with its foundation that I thought we could build on top of. Firstly, the game is brutally hard. Having your movement tied to the song was very difficult for me to maneuver, and I consider myself a bit above the average mechanically. Secondly, giving the player the ability to make the song felt like a really cool way to give the player a bit more agency and give them some incremental growth between rounds, kind of like item pickups in Vampire Survivors. So as a starter, we mapped out a basic idea, a fretboard with 2 slots for notes where you could put one of 3 notes in each slot. Initially, we just wanted a dash note, a shoot note, and an AoE note. The goal was to keep the scope really small such that we could really focus on juice and polish this year, as scope creep is usually what kills our Game Jam games. I rigged up the starter build using some simple squares and some boilerplate top-down shooter numbers which we'd need to tweak in the future. As we were making a rhythm game, we implemented some simple sounds really early on to get a feel for the concept and make sure that everything felt together well. Somewhere along the way, we decided that rather than playing both notes at once, it would be cooler if they combined. So we built combinations for each set of notes, which was a bit tough as it turned our 3 simple abilities into 9 abilities. But by rigging up the shooting code so that you could tell it the bullet type, the number of bullets, and the arc size, it was very easy to implement the different abilities to tweak the numbers to try different arcs or bullet counts. Similarly, because the dash was just a blast of velocity on the player body, by setting an inverted direction, we were able to add knockback to certain shots, so they added almost no coding overhead. I also added some simple mobs that walk towards the player, and deal damage so the player has something to shoot. The first build was promising, but a big concern early on was the dash being really difficult to use. Even for us, it was really hard to get into the rhythm to prepare for when it was about to launch you, so that it wouldn't launch you into enemies. I sent through the first build to the team and we gave it a try. We decided that we needed to scrap the dash note, as it was just far too hard to control. As this left us with just 2 shots, or 5 if you include the combos, we were at a bit of a crossroads, whether we should add more attack notes or focus more on these 5 combos. Combos seem nice, but it's a lot harder to guarantee that a player would see them all in a game, and they're a lot trickier to teach. So we decided to remove combos and add a few more shot types. We then added some new basic mob types to give the game a bit more variety. We added one that had a detection range and will ignore you until you get close, but then rushes at you. Then we added a speaker that hangs out in the corners and shoots at you. This gave us the major bones of the game. We rigged the game to work at 120 BPM, with a note being triggered every half second. This let the audio person get started on some of the tunes that had a progression based on these 1 to 2 bar sets, so it aligned with the fretboard, while I coded up the mobs and shots. Our artist was busy building art assets for the various shots, enemies, and building the fretboard asset. We wanted the fretboard to be an actual object, and we wanted to put every HUD element within it so that it all worked diegetically. From here, we basically had a finished but unpolished Game Jam game. So, once we had these components set up, and spaces for the art and audio once those things got finalized, I started to build a list of the various pieces of polish that I think make a good Game Jam game. Games need a clear win condition and to be completable in 5-ish minutes, a functioning web build, a competitive element, usually either a speedrun timer or high score system, a way for them to play more if they'd like an endless mode or bonus levels, a way to ensure that the game is fun for bad players, and a way to ensure that the game is challenging for good players. It needs to work in full screen, and it needs to have a volume slider. Most of these were easy elements to add. The biggest challenge was the functioning web build and competitive element. The web build had some audio desync issues that really affected the game field, but we shelved this until we had the real audio in so we could debug fully. For the competitive element, we decided to slap a high score on it and put in an endless mode. While this is a bit of a ham-fisted solution, it does work pretty well for Game Jam games, and especially this arcadey style of Game Jam game that we're going for. Plus, we couldn't do a speedrun timer with hard-coded level times, because the level times needed to align with the song lengths. This alone got us to a spot where I was really happy with everything. By the time we finished integrating the art assets, enemy designs, and audio, we had about 3 hours left before our feature freeze, which would then give us about 1 hour of playtesting before submission, and 3 hours of safety net in case things went catastrophically wrong. Unfortunately, the next hour and a half was spent trying to fix the web desync, which I think was caused by a delay when the song first loads. In the end, the easiest solution seemed to be to silently play all songs when the game first loads, and then unmute them when they first need to play for the first time in-game. Pink had designed a whole boss fight for the final level, which would have 2 hands that fired off attacks and moved around the screen. But with the time we had left, we settled for putting in a boss in the final level and having it shoot projectiles out of its eyes rather than its hands, and we left the hands out entirely. I'd also never gotten around to implementing the laser enemy, so I quickly threw that in as well, and that basically took us to the end of the feature freeze. Then we spent the next hour or two playing the game, catching bugs, tweaking enemy numbers, and spawn locations until we got a version we were finally happy with. Then just before we submitted, we realized we never set a good developer high score, so we grinded a little bit longer until we got a high score we were happy with. Then we put that in the game as the score to beat and published it. The reception was really positive this year, with some absolutely delightful comments. We had a series of streamers try it live, which helped a lot as we could see their live reaction to the systems. As for the results, we were really happy with the ratings, with the notable exceptions being the narrative and artwork scores, which placed just below 2,000th each. I think the artwork scores were lightly affected by the stylistic choices, which didn't appeal to players. Firstly, the top-down aesthetic makes it a lot harder to do characterization, so the art was a little more simplistic and mechanical in that way. I think a strong piece of character art on the loading screen or even the title screen may have been enough to personify the player character enough to get a better score here. The synth controller at the bottom of the screen was an absolute work of art. I think this was underappreciated, potentially because it was outside the player's main view during gameplay. Secondly, we noticed a number of streamers rated the game 1 star for narrative, based on the argument that there wasn't an explicit story. Whilst I think this is more of a problem with the category, whilst we didn't provide an explicit in-game story with cutscenes or dialogue, all the components were cohesive and all the in-game language was built with a specific flavor in mind. As such, for my barometer for evaluating our overall success, I decided to omit the narrative score and just sum the artwork, creativity, enjoyment, and audio to a total of 4.07, which would have placed us in 213th place last year. This year they didn't give an overall score, so we can't know for sure. As for quick fixes to improve the game and its rating, a few notable problems were identified that could have been implemented quickly and improved the process. A lack of bad luck detection meant that players could get all lasers or all base drops, as a player only got 1 each round. In my head, 1 in 8 was rare enough not to really worry about, but it seemed to happen to quite a few players during streams. So a simple check to ensure that a player gets at least 1 of each by the time they hit the boss fight would make sure that no player missed out. Secondly, players who didn't prioritize shooting the enemies that shot back often found themselves overwhelmed, as more would spawn and they wouldn't have dealt with the last ones. This, on top of the fact that these were typically the worst players who weren't dashing, meant that the worst players were often versing the hardest challenges. So a hidden mechanism to determine if the player was playing poorly and adjusting the difficulty would have helped a lot. In the post-jam version, I've set it to only spawn another speaker or laser enemy if the last one is already gone, preventing players from getting overrun, but not reducing the challenge for players who are shooting the mobs as they spawn. Players rarely use the dash, despite the controls being on screen at all times. This probably needs to be fixed by better play conditioning, by training the player to use the dash in the earlier levels, so that they're in the mindset to use it when they need to. This one we still haven't found a great solution to, but I like the idea of some mechanism that rewards the player for dashing on beat. Other than this, a lot of people provided feedback that the game needed more visual clarity, but I have a suspicion that this might be more of an issue with difficulty balance rather than the actual visuals, but time will tell on that one once a new version has had a bit more playtesting. That's all I've got to cover in our game. If you play it, I hope you like it. Please comment with your high score if you do. I spent some time grinding, and now the new high score is 130k. Also, I'm thinking of doing up a list of games I'd like to highlight from the jam, but as a starting point, if you like this style of game and want to try more or compare with some similar ideas, Voodloop and Dance the Stereomancer were similar ideas, the first using a beat loop for a puzzle platformer, and the latter using the beat loop for something closer to a Vampire Survivors like. absolutely go check those out as well. Thanks for listening.